This video is sponsored by me and you. Find out more at the end. The author of the Quran is quite fond of hell. At least that's the impression I get when I pay attention to how often he invokes it. Jahannam this and An-Nar that. It's hard to read a page of the Quran without stumbling upon a verse reminding you of hell, or more horrifyingly, the graphic details of how God will inflict pain upon you forever if you don't believe what you're reading. Instead of confining the divine revelation to convincing and rational statements, the author resorts to these threats to cover up for the deficiencies in his argumentation, kind of like the da'wah men with an affinity for chest thumping and escalations to violence. Yes, I mean people like Muhammad Hijab. Clearly, Allah created da'wah men in his image. And this scare tactic is unfortunately effective to some extent at keeping the masses obedient and remaining in their beliefs. It's hard to get the statistics on this, obviously, but there are millions of Muslims who are held back from questioning because they fear hell, or they have doubts to the point of no longer believing in Islam, yet they're still held back by the trepidation. But I'm here to assure you that there is a way out of that frightful trap. And I know that on good authority because I have been there. I was a God-fearing, hell-fearing, submissive Muslim. I was the buzzkill who might not get invited to a hangout because I'd remind everyone of how haram their actions were. I used to ask myself before every decision, will this bring me closer to hell? I used to feel weighed down by the ever-looming threat of eternal torture for billions of souls, and that's certainly no way to live a happy and fulfilling life. But look at me now. I'm a blasphemer whose interpretation of making the world a better place would land him in the deepest pits of Islamic hell, and yet he remains unfazed. Why am I talking about myself in the third person? That's so Allah of me. Since it's Ramadan, I feel like it's a good time to tell you about my experience with the Islamic hell and how I got over it. During this month, Allah does us all a solid and locks up the devil, so theists can't say that the devil is speaking through me, which is so mean, by the way. I work so hard and the devil gets all the credit. Get the hell out of here. I get that it's a serious topic, and I use humor now to disarm the religion, but when I first learned about hell, it was no laughing matter. As a child, it was initially introduced to me as a place where sinners go. Adults wouldn't just say that lying and stealing are bad, they'd say al-kadhab biruh an-nar or al-harami biruh an-nar, meaning the liar and the thief go to the fire. And an-nar, meaning the fire, is one of the most common Arabic names for hell. There was no ambiguity about it being a flaming pit of burning flesh, unlike in some other religions where it's viewed as a state of unrest or separation from God. As you can imagine, it's not so healthy to link eternal torture to a word that is commonly used in everyday vocabulary, because every lit stovetop can be a reminder of the horrors of hell. And it wasn't just used to scare kids out of committing crimes, it extends to anything and everything that could be considered sinful. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for preachers, parents, and teachers to say the following to children. Imagine putting your hand over the stove. You can't even hold it for 1 second because it's so painful, and that's just a tiny flame. You'd be crying and whimpering, begging for it to be over. Now imagine how agonizing it would be to burn in hell from head to toe, over and over with no end in sight. So, you better not miss a prayer. Some people had it worse than I did. Though I attended Quran classes, I didn't go to an Islamic school where I'd be fed this rhetoric daily, and my parents didn't threaten me with hell all the time, unlike some other parents. But they didn't need to. The Quran alone terrorized me. And that's the kind of widespread religious terror that most people don't acknowledge. There's no campaign against threats of harm as long as they're attributed to a God. Since I was about 8 years old, I had been reading and memorizing the Quran, starting with the shortest surahs, meaning chapters, at the end of the book. And the way I memorized it was sequential and cumulative, meaning that I'd memorize a chapter, recite it back, memorize a second chapter, recite both of them back, and so on. Within the first juz I memorized, the first 23 pages, Hell or Judgment Day are talked about in 21 of those pages, meaning that since I first started praying 5 times a day, I was guaranteed to recite a verse about hell pretty much every single day of my life. And the reactions I witnessed around me were very confusing. Some people seemed to not care very much. Perhaps they were comforted by the belief that a Muslim will not go to hell eternally, temporarily at worst, or that hell is reserved for disbelievers and evil people, but not them. Many would joke about what kinds of people will be sent to hell, even taking pleasure in describing how they'll be catapulted or thrown in. It's very sadistic and devoid of empathy, but it's the picture the Quran itself paints, mentioning how Muslims will have the last laugh as they spectate over the burning disbelievers. I, on the other hand, was horrified at the thought of anyone going to hell, especially if their crime is just not believing the wild tales that I grew up with. But instead of recognizing that the empathy I had was a good thing, it made me feel insane and unique in all the wrong ways. Some people actually sought comfort in knowing that those who wronged them are going to suffer in hell, be it tyrants, criminals, or some other group, usually non-Muslim. I would very often hear it said during prayers and sermons, even at the Holy Mosque in Mecca, praying that God seeks revenge on whoever they deem evil or an enemy of humanity or an enemy of Islam. Torture and revenge became synonymous with justice, and this ingrained in my society a very simplistic, violent, and shallow approach to dealing with problems, such as, for example, praising hand-chopping as a solution for theft, and favoring retribution over rehabilitation, and other similar sentiments which jive very well with authoritarian states. The acceptance of divine revenge also normalized mixing love and fear. I was supposed to love Allah while He held a gun to my head on pretty much every page of the Quran, so I learned to accept that poisoned flavor of love in my personal life as well. A loved one could suddenly snap at me angrily and I take it because I got used to the emotional whiplash while reading Allah's words. The Quran is full of grand statements, boasting, promises of heaven and promises of hell, and you rarely know which of these is next. Besides, if the most pious and God-loving Muslims still have to fear Allah and His threats, then there is no safety in love. There's no safety in life, even as a Muslim. So I accepted that it's normal to be anxious all the time, for seemingly no reason, because there's always a valid reason to be anxious, my tyrant God and his obsession with hell. Unfortunately, I still struggle with anxiety to this day despite no longer fearing hell. Nevertheless, deconstruction from hell was a necessary and helpful step towards healing. Going back to my childhood, naturally, I noticed that some people lived in that paranoia, reminding themselves and others of hell and what they needed to do differently to avoid it. I would see stickers on cars and buses and walls with reminders of praying to Allah or fearing hell. I would hear imams say so casually before prayer, "Pray this one as if it's your last," to remind us of our mortality and proximity to judgment and torture. Where I come from, you would describe a man as fearful of Allah as a compliment, to mean that he's very moral and upstanding. There was this sense of glorification of being terrified of Allah's wrath, to the point that imams would cry of fear in the middle of prayer or dua, and the crowds would cry with them. Some people cried because they too understood the magnitude of the hell they're being terrorized with. Some cried because if the imam leading the prayer in Mecca is scared, maybe they should be scared too. And many cried because of our human tendency to conform with our surroundings, so whether they understood the words or not, they too felt the fear and cried along.
Crying out of the fear of Allah is a legitimate reason. Crying out of remembering your sins or the torment that awaits you. Crying out of the love of Allah Azza wa Jal. Crying out of remembering something that is related to Salah. These are legitimate reasons.
There's no shortage of videos on the internet of these moments of mass hysteria, and they're largely admired and revered. It's very masochistic and eerie for tens of thousands of strangers to unite in encouraging each other to be terrified. And whether by design or not, I suspect that it plays a significant role in subduing the masses and alienating those who think differently. I, for example, was also terrified of hell, but I couldn't for the life of me see the beauty or virtue in having that fear. I felt that my family members had more in common with Muslim strangers at the mosque than with me. I felt that there was something wrong with me, something that I'm just not getting. Otherwise, I'd be wailing with the crowds and counting my good deeds for doing it. Even more perplexing was how those who were consistent in their paranoia would get sneered at by other Muslims. Those who paid attention to the intricate details of Islam and did their best to avoid hell would be labeled fundamentalists, extremists, or just crazy. For example, if there's a mixed opinion on whether music is haram or not, the paranoid would avoid music just in case, and others would scoff at how exaggerated and over the top that is. But if you truly believe in hell and digest its sheer horror, why wouldn't you be obsessive about avoiding sin? Especially when God is constantly monitoring your every thought and action. It just seemed more prudent to be paranoid about hell. On the other hand, most Muslims around me lived in such monumental cognitive dissonance that it was common to see belly dancers at Muslim weddings. It's a stunning contrast when most of the female attendees, including the bride herself, would watch and clap as their men salivated at the sight of a scantily clad woman shaking her breasts. I was tormented and alienated because I was more introspective than the adults around me. and I didn't have the luxury of severe cognitive dissonance to shelter me from thinking about hell. It's not like this so-called fundamentalist way of living would have solved my problems, but at least it's consistent. On top of all the incongruence that I witnessed around me, I had my own sins to worry about, and my self-awareness didn't do me any favors. I didn't know it at the time, but I have ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. It presents differently in different people, and I'll leave some reading material in the description if you'd like to learn more. What's relevant to this video is how it posed difficult challenges for me with impulse control, focus, memory, and motivation. I was predisposed to forget to pray, or to get distracted when I do pray. It was difficult for me to interrupt my focus on whatever I was doing for something as repetitive and uninteresting as prayer, 5 times a day, and then go back to the original task. But I forced myself because I had no choice. If you don't pray, you go to hell. And it takes a lot of effort for me to do something if it doesn't give me instant gratification. Delayed gratification is motivating, but instant gratification is a lot more effective. And that's not to say that praying or reading Quran didn't feel rewarding to me at all. At first, it used to. I was excited about learning from the Quran, and I was excited about improving my tajweed, which is the recitation of the Quran in a melodic way. And I received a lot of praise for it from family and teachers and friends, and I took pride in that. I was even excited about racking up hasanat, meaning brownie points, for praying and reading the Quran, with the long-term gratification being heaven and avoiding hell. But all that gradually faded the more that I learned and questioned. Reading the Quran meant exposure to silly and contradictory verses, as well as reminders of hell. And heaven didn't seem that appealing to me. I didn't care for the silk, the rivers of honey, sex slaves, or mansions. So both instant and delayed gratification were out of the picture, and religious rituals felt more like self-harm than spiritual motivation. The problem wasn't just doing what I had to do. It's the guilt and shame that came with my internal resistance to doing it, because I was taught that this resistance comes from shaitan, not neurological or psychological factors, but, I kid you not, the literal devil that's urinating into my orifices. If I didn't get up to pray, maybe it's because shaitan peed in my ear. If I found something in the Quran nonsensical, maybe it's because the shaitan whispered those doubts into me. I was so frustrated at myself for being so susceptible to the devil's manipulation, and the way to make myself less susceptible was to neurotically and repetitively mention Allah's name in prayer, and to read Quran. The very same things that made me anxious. So, you see my predicament? When I didn't focus on Islam, I felt guilty for allowing myself to be vulnerable to the devil. When I did focus on Islam, I felt guilty for not being enthusiastic about it, and also dreadful because of the constant reminders of judgment and hell. I was trapped in an obsessive-compulsive hell on earth. And at the same time, puberty hit. And where I come from, there is no sex ed. All I was told was that premarital sex is one of the biggest sins, and masturbation is a huge sin, and sexual urges are from the devil. So I felt guilty and ashamed for being horny. I do not miss my teenage years. Again, this was very confusing. I would avoid checking out people, whether it was a woman at the mall or a belly dancer, and yet I still felt sexual urges, because that's natural and healthy. But to me, it wasn't. It was a sign of weakness to the devil, and a reminder of my proximity to hell. And do you know how hard it is to not think about something when you're constantly reminded to not think about it? Here's an example. Don't think of giraffes. Now, what are you thinking about? Giraffes? Oh, you filthy, filthy sinner. Ramadan was a particularly difficult time because I blamed myself completely for my sinful thought crimes and my impulses. Because although shaitan was supposed to be locked up during the month, my religious anxiety, reluctance to pray, impulses, critical thoughts, and all that, they did not subside. So rather than concluding that this indicates shaitan never existed to begin with, I concluded that I was so tainted by the devil that his contribution was no longer necessary for my demise. My nafs al-ammara bis-su, my sinful soul, was as corrupt as the devil's influence on me. So for the longest time, this mentality kept my critical thoughts from flourishing into doubts and investigation about the truthfulness of Islam. I felt guilty and hellbound for daring to question, because doubts are the whispers of the devil. Every time I hear a preacher say that, I want to smack them so hard that all they can think about is giraffes. But then I remember that I should not express frustration like Allah and the Muslim men around me, so instead I just dissect their words to take away their power. But up until a few years ago, I wasn't so sure of myself. I was plagued with recurring nightmares about hell and the Day of Judgment. usually in the form of the end of the world and my resurrection and awaiting judgment and being told that I'm given a second chance. And as a Muslim, I'm supposed to believe in superstitions like devils, black magic, and that dreams have meanings. Not only that, but if you speak to the Prophet in a dream, that is the actual Prophet himself, I was told. So I really believe that God was beaming these signals into my head to warn me of my impending doom and give me a second chance at being a better Muslim. Mind you, I suffered from these nightmares before having committed any major sins. They would come and go sporadically throughout the years, and they definitely intensified towards the end of my journey out of Islam. Earlier on, I'd treat them as a stern warning, so I'd work harder on being a better Muslim, adhering to prayers more regularly, reading more Quran, praying at the mosque more often, and so on. But it was never a permanent solution, so that became a cyclical hell on earth. I know it sounds like a lot of doom and gloom so far, but here is where the sad part ends. I got over my fear of hell when I acknowledged my doubts and set out on a mission to disprove the kafir in me. In other words, I did my best to prove Islam true. I spent months digging for answers for every question and doubt that I had, and then I spoke to faith counselors and sheikhs from various Islamic backgrounds. And aside from asking them about what I found to be problematic or unusual or irrational, I also asked them to help me find the ideal pitch for Islam. If I were a non-Muslim, how would you sell me on this religion? How can you convince me of the truth of Islam without appealing to my Muslim bias, without grand presuppositions? And the answer was nothing to write home about. I found myself dissecting the rambling without even intending to, just so I can get them to give me a straight answer. And that's when it clicked. Their authority is just a facade. It's not me who doesn't get it. It's Islamic apologists who can't explain the problems in Islam away without burying themselves neck deep in fallacious arguments. Not just because they're fallible humans who might not be the smartest men out there, but because the source material itself, Islam, buries them neck deep in fallacious arguments. It was only then, when I was researching Islam to find proof and reassurance, after a couple of decades of feeling like something is wrong with me, that's when I first stumbled upon ex-Muslims. That's when I first realized that my thoughts were neither original nor whispers of the devil. And by then, my fear of hell was subsiding rapidly, because it's harder to fear something I know is not real. But it was one last nightmare that cured my fears once and for all. Isn't that poetic? A few years ago, I noticed an increase in the frequency and intensity of dreams for a couple of weeks, and most of them were not about hell. And I found out that it was a side effect of a medication that I had recently started taking. Most of these dreams incorporated themes from my subconscious, like memories and things that I was worried about. But one of those dreams happened to be the worst nightmare I've ever had. It was about coming out as an ex-Muslim and the Day of Judgment. And I'll spare you the details, but it involved a lot of earthquakes and fires and other flowery images inspired by the Quran. I've known for a long time that dreams incorporate thoughts already floating in my head, but that particular nightmare was a sobering reminder that dreams have nothing to do with gods or devils. They're not supernatural. It's all chemistry and biology. If diet, exercise, stress, and medication can affect my dreams about hell, then God has nothing to do with it. And I haven't had a single nightmare about hell in years. I can confidently say that I don't have an iota of fear of hell. Islam has done a number on me in many ways, and I'm always a work in progress, but I'm happy to report that hell is dead, and I killed it. Make no mistake, the summary of all I said today is not that hell is horrible, therefore Islam is false. My feelings about hell have no bearing on the truth of it. I didn't leave the religion because I was afraid of hell. I stayed in the religion because I was afraid of hell. But ironically, hell only existed as long as I believed in it. Hell was the mental anguish that I endured as a believer with critical thoughts. Hell was hating myself for being susceptible to shaitan, or in less delusional terms, it was hating myself for the traits that made me incapable of gullibility and blind faith. Hell is not real, but pretending it's real is how believers harm themselves and each other without a fire or burnt flesh. I certainly can't stop a believer from self-harming, but I'll do my part to stop them from forcing these ideas on others. It wasn't easy for me to get over hell, and it wasn't easy for me to make this video, but I hope that it reaches and helps as many people as possible. Know that you're not alone, and you're not crazy. You don't have to be in that solitary hell anymore. I think that there is no way to teach children about the Islamic hell without traumatizing those among them who notice its problems. I think the concept itself is harmful, and no amount of sugarcoating hell will make Allah look less like an egomaniac with a torture fetish. In the next video, I'll list 10 approaches to help you overcome your fear of hell, but feel free to beat me to it and comment your suggestions for how to overcome hell, or comment what you thought of this video, and give it a like if you like it. And lastly, I'd like to thank all my patrons, YouTube members, and donors. You're the reason I'm able to continue this work that I'm really passionate about. You're the reason that this is a video on YouTube instead of a rambling internal monologue. And if more of you choose to support me, I can keep doing this for longer, and we can have an even greater impact together. And as always, think critically, and think for yourself. And don't think of giraffes.